Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace.
Hello.
These are unprecedented times, and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists, and public service workers about how we come out of this mess in much better shape than we went in, a good society after COVID-19. These conversations have live access for Compass members who can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to participate in a live call and help support all of our work, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's podcast. This week on the Compass podcast, It's Bloody Complicated, we are joined by Matthew Taylor, CEO of the Royal Society of Arts. Matthew is a friend of mine at Compass. I have huge respect for his intellect and experience, which we're going to try and unlock as much of as possible in the next 60 minutes. I look forward to every call, but I've been particularly looking forward to this one. As ever, I'll ask our guests a few questions, and then it's over to Compass members to put their points and their questions. So, Matthew, we always start with this. Welcome. Tell us where you are, but particularly tell us how you are.
So I'm in Clapham, in the second spare bedroom, which has really been my office or den for the last few months, and where I record my own podcast from. And I'm okay, I guess. Yeah, I'm kind of slightly in between things because I've just finished writing a book and I've sent it out to people for comments, and I've given them till tomorrow to come back to me. So then I'll have to address their comments. So kind of slightly in the slight limbo, because when I've got the book finished, I'll have to think about what the next project is. And I'm back to work, and, you know, I've been in the RSA a long time and I won't be there forever. So I'm kind of really focused on how we make sure the RSA, because we've been through a strategic review, how it moves to a different stage. I want to leave it on a high. And at the risk of being matey, I'm a bit worried about West Bromwich Albion, because, of course, the thing is, my football team's been promoted, and, you know, anyone who studies happiness will understand that there's two different types of happiness. There's a kind of happiness which is when you're asked to describe your kind of existential state, and then there's happiness when you're actually asked to describe how you feel day to day. And this is just an insight for people who aren't football fans. When your team gets promoted, your existential happiness goes up because you're proud that they've been promoted and you feel a warmth about that. But your day-to-day happiness declines dramatically because, of course, your team is now in a division where it's not very good and it loses nearly every game. So I'm proud that my football team's been promoted, but I look forward to Saturdays of misery. I won't watch Match of the Day for a whole year now because it'll just be miserable. So that's all the little bits of my life put together for you, Neil.
Okay, my team got relegated, so medium to long term, I'm going to be incredibly happy because we'll win more games.
Charlton will do very well next season. Every Saturday will be a joy for you.
Well, I'm sure. Well, just tell us what's the book about.
So the book, I edit a series of books for Thames and Hudson called the Big Ideas series. They're all called things like Is Democracy Over? Or Can Capitalism Work? Or What is Gender? Or Should We All Be Vegans? And having kind of edited lots of books in the series, they finally asked me to do one. So I've just written a book called Do We Need to Work? Okay. And it's kind of important to me, Neil, because I've written another book I've been writing for 10 years, and which there is not a publisher of non-fiction books in the Western Hemisphere that hasn't read it and rejected it. And that's been a kind of slightly demoralizing experience. So this book, which is only 17,000 words, even though it's only 17,000 words, and even though it's my specialist subject work, I kind of got really uptight about it. And I've written it, and my wife, who's very loyal to me, and by the way, who says hello to you, Neil, she likes it, but she might just be nice to me. So I'm waiting for the comments to slightly bated breath, and then I'll change it, and then I'll get it off. And if it gets published, even though it's only 17,000 words, and it is a book with lots of pictures, that's the only way I can get my stuff out into a bookshop. I will have a sense of achievement about that. It made me feel slightly less bad about my massive book of social theory and political and progressive politics, which is sitting under my bed gathering dust.
Every book, and I'm sure by yours, will have its moment. And what's the answer? Do we need to work, Matthew?
Yes, we do. Not for some of the reasons that people give. don't necessarily need to work in order to generate revenue, because you can generate revenue from other places. And there have been times when we haven't generated revenue from work. You should generate more revenue from environmental taxes, for example. We don't actually need to work, I don't think, to generate profits, because as Google and Facebook show, you can make an enormous amount of money from relatively small amount of people. So I don't think government finances, and I don't think capitalism actually are the things that require us to work. I think the division of labor is what requires us to work. The fact of the matter is, when we, in pre-industrial ages, peasants grew their, they planted crops, they ate those crops, they built their own houses, they tended their houses, they were largely, not entirely, but largely self-sufficient. If you think about our average day, we probably directly and indirectly rely every day on tens of thousands of people to make our lives normal. So someone's got to do that work, and robots aren't going to do all of it. So yes, we do need to work, because the division of labor is what brings us the fruits of modernity, and I don't think we're going to want to give those up. But the question is, does work need to feel like work? And so what I do in the book is I explore the kind of generic reasons why I think work feels onerous, and I offer three. So the first is control. So the sense of being controlled, what Elizabeth Anderson, the American philosopher, calls private government, the sense that when you work for an organization, it can tell you what to do, but you have no kind of rights of accountability or whatever. Secondly, competition, the idea that the purpose of activity, and this isn't, obviously, Neil, just in the private sector, but in the public and third sector as well, that all we're really ever doing is competing. And I think that is demoralizing, because in the end, nobody, as John Kay once said, nobody ever lay on their deathbed and said, thank God I raised the shareholder value. We want to do things for a purpose. And competition is fine, but it's got to be competition in pursuit of a purpose. And too often in organizations, competition for the sake of competition is what the focus is. And I think that's dehumanizing. And then thirdly, consumerism. And this refers, of course, to your own book, Neil, which is that kind of thesis, which, that people like Daniel Bell argued, and that you argued as well, I think, to an extent, which is the shift from our identity being based on production to identity being based on consumption involves a kind of Faustian pact, which kind of says that work may be shit, but at least I can buy nice stuff, and that is, again, I think, pretty dehumanizing. So what I explore in the final chapter of the book are the kinds of things that you might do if you wanted work not to feel like work.
Brilliant. Okay, well, what we'll do is when it's out, we'll bring you back to discuss that, and we might get someone like John Cruddas to come and talk about it with you, or some basic income people or whatever. That sounds brilliant. Tell us a bit.
Yeah, see, John, I must just make this point about John. John fundamentally, I don't know where. I mean, I'm really fond of John. I've known him for a long time. He's brilliant, but he has this habit of saying that anyone who supports universal basic income, like I do, doesn't believe in the dignity of work, and that's complete codswallop, to be honest, because as you know, proper universal basic income, not the kind of anarcho-idealist UBI when we're all kind of fishing in the morning, reading Plato in the afternoon and all the works. I don't mean, fully automated luxury communism. I mean a real practical UBI like they have in Finland. It's fundamentally there to strengthen work incentives and also to enable people to make work choices. It's not an anti-work policy at all. And John's very intelligent, and it kind of slightly gets me down that he spent so many years misportraying UBI. I mean, there are people who support UBI who give John plenty of ammunition for that position, but it isn't a reasonable position.
And if John's listening, I think we need to recognise that he's moved some way on that, and I think he's possibly more sympathetic, or at least open to the conversation. But
that's what happens when you get. That's what happens when you get old. You're having arguments that changed 10 years ago. It's like, what can I say?
It's why we need to get out of the way. So just tell us a bit about your work life, so people can locate you. Matthew Taylor, you're now the chief executive of the RSA, which you've been for a while, and very productively. Just talk people through your political life, about how you got to that point and what you've done, so they can see where you're coming from, Matthew.
Okay, really briefly. So I don't know. A few kind of key moments where I suppose I think where, like most people, I kind of think I am where I am by accident. But so I'll describe one critical moment for me, which was 1981. And I think I'm right in saying, you as you get older, you create mythologies about your past. So maybe I'm just completely wrong about this. Someone in the chat will tell me, but I think I'm right in saying that the same summer of the famous Australia-England Ashes series, the Botham and Willis series, was also the summer when the Labour Party chose its deputy leader between Dennis Healey and Tony Benn. And the reason that it's important for me is not just because I remember that summer and I remember the cricket, but also I was a Bennite and I was out campaigning for Ben. And I was sitting with a friend of mine called Richard Lee, who I think last I heard of him was working in Southwark. But anyway, Richard and I were sitting side by side. We'd been decorating a house, actually, my student house. And we were watching the Labour Party conference. And I remember, I don't know whether Richard turned to me or I turned to him, but one of us turned to the other and said, if Ben wins, it's all over, don't you? And at that moment, my kind of youthful radicalism just fell away like a kind of a snake shedding a skin. I just suddenly thought, I've been campaigning for Ben because I was kind of knee-jerk left-winger. I was young. And at that moment, I realized that if Ben won, the Labour Party was going to be out of power for a very long time. Of course, the Labour Party was out of power for a very long time. But, I think the Labour Party would have completely disintegrated, as it nearly did. So that was a kind of really important moment for me, because that was the moment at which I stopped being an instinctive left-winger, which I had been up to that point. I just had that kind of youthful thing that you have, which is whatever the most left-wing position is, well, that's the position I adopt because I'm young and radical. And so I was an old fogey. At the age of, 21, I, for the first time, abandoned the left and became a reformist. And so that's kind of my political positioning has ever been. It's been defined by that, because for me, that was a moment when I thought, actually, what's the point of having a radical Labour Party if it's never going to win any elections? So, and that goes on, that thought. And then I kind of mithered around and didn't really make much of my life in career terms. And then I kind of unexpectedly got a job with the Labour Party in the early 90s. And then I wasn't really doing particularly well at the Labour Party. In fact, I was thinking of leaving, really. I was a bit lonely, and everyone knew that. Everyone in the Labour Party knew each other from Labour students. They were probably, people you'd know. But I didn't. I came in outside, I didn't really know anybody, so I felt a bit miserable. And then I got a double promotion because the director of policy left. He was a guy called Roland Wales. He left, I think, because he didn't have much sympathy with the Blairite project. And they had to find a replacement. I remember writing to David Miliband, who was head of policy for Blair, and saying, look, I'd quite like to be director of policy. I was working in the campaign team. I was 2 levels below this. And they obviously looked for someone else. They couldn't find anybody else. And so I didn't get a reply from David until the day before the thing, when someone said, okay, you're the Blairite candidate. So, oh, right, okay then. So, actually, it's worse than that. The day before that, I had man flu. I mean, I was really ill, but it was man flu. I got a phone call, will I go and see Peter Mandelson? So I had to go and see Peter Mandelson. I was feeling very ill. And I think he was just a kind of interview, and he interviewed me. And then I had to go and see Tony. I had to go to Tony's house in Islington, and he had to kind of interview me. And then they decided I was the Blairite candidate. This all happened about 24 hours. And then they had to get the NEC to vote for me. And that was the closest Tony ever came until late on to lose a vote at the NEC. It was incredibly close. And I think it came down to Tom Sawyer, who was the General Secretary, came down his casting a vote, because the unions, who always really hated me, still hate me. I don't know why, really. I quite like unions. But anyway, they always kind of hated me, and they hated me then as well. I don't know what it is about me. But and they tried so hard to stop me, and they didn't. Anyway, so I then became director of policy. I therefore was quite senior in the 1997 campaign, which is kind of good for your credibility. I then stayed at the party. I redesigned the party's democracy a bit. I went to IPPR for 5 years. Fantastic time there, great time. Rebuilt it because it was slightly in the doldrums because so many of its stars had gone into government when Labour got into government. Eventually, on the third time of asking, I went into number 10. I was there from a year before, from 2004 to 2003 to 2006. Helped to write the 2005 manifesto, which I'm quite proud of. And then I went to the RSA, and I've been at the RSA for 14 years. So there we are. And I guess intellectually, very briefly, my kind of progression has been that very early moment of deciding that I was a radical, but I was a radical who wanted to be part of something that had power rather than just, activist symbolism. I've always believed I am deep down a radical, but I'm a pragmatic radical who wants to make a difference. And then I guess the other little journey I've been on going to the RSA is I've become quite disenchanted with the kind of old ways which I thought about change. I don't really think that change is now all about pamphlets, policies, and and articles in the Guardian. I think it's more complex and, in ways that I'm sure we'll talk about, Neil. So that's why I went to the RSA, which is a peculiar organisation when I joined it, and a wonderful organisation. But it offered me a way of thinking about change and pursuing change, and it's been really hard work, and I haven't cracked it properly. But I think we are a really interesting organisation and quite unusual, and that's been fun.
Yeah, unusual and unique and quite special. You reminded me in your little tour around your political life, Matthew. One of my most liberating moments was exactly that time. There was an article in the New Statesman, in the New Socialist, you'll remember it, called Bennism without Ben. And I remember reading it and the relief to think that you could have a radical politics which weren't actually aligned to someone who you didn't think was ever going to, gain, win, and use power effectively. And we've both been on the same track. And there's a bit of, we'll come back to Corbynism in a while maybe. So just one bit that just is useful for people on the call tonight and on the podcast later in the week. You with me were the kind of, two of four instigators of Compass back in 2003, the others being Michael Jacobs and Tom Bentley, Michael from the Fabians and Tom Bentley from Demos, and you were at the LPPR then. I mean, just so that people understand some of the roots and origins of it, what do you remember of what we were trying to do then in terms of our relationship with New Labour before you went on to join Tony?
You see, Neil, this is, as I was preparing for today, by which I simply mean thinking about it on the way back from Clapham Common Tube Station, I suddenly realised something. This is exactly... There is a very, very similar thing going on now to what was happening then. Now, the big difference is we were in power then, right? But the split between radicals and moderates, reformists, pragmatists, whatever you want to call it. And, I can see people in the Zoom chat talking about, well, was Corbyn a Benite, was Benite, whatever. I mean, I try best not to get fixated on labels, but we came together, Neil, because we were critical of Labour in government in various ways. I think we were particularly critical of the centralism of Labour. We both accepted the David Marquand thesis, which was that that progressivism had to be about bottom-up change of the heart, not just top-down change from the head, right? And we felt that Labour was too centralising, too technocratic, too controlling. We thought that some political mistakes had been made. I think, trying to block Ken Livingstone, trying to block Rhodri Morgan, the way in which, and this, if you do get John Cruddas on, this is my biggest criticism of John Cruddas, great man though he is that he was there when Blair abandoned John Monks and the modernising possibilities of the trade unions in favour of mobilising Ken Jackson to try and stop Ken Livingstone and Rhodri Morgan. I'd love to hear John talk about that, because I was rereading Tony's biography the other day, because I'm doing the BBC are doing a series, the Blair years, like the Thatcher years. And so I was rereading it. And an interesting thing about that, in that biography, 350 pages, look in the index, you will not see the name John Monks. And what's interesting about that is that John Monks was a really modernising, really thoughtful General Secretary of the TUC. And the Labour Party completely flunked the possibility that John Monks offered for industrial partnerships. So anyway, we had criticisms about lack of courage around industrial democracy, industrial partnership, around centralisation, around a kind of control mentality, right? But we did not want to throw our lot in with the kind of, oppositionalist, Blair's a traitor, blah, 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 because as already discussed, that's really not our style and not our politics. And so that was why we did it. We did it to try to keep a bridge between the kind of radical progressivism and the kind of practical project of Labour in government, to try to make a difference without schism through building a bridge. And as you know, the RSA for the last few months has been using this phrase, building bridges to the future. Yeah. And the point is, Neil, as I suddenly realised as I walked back from Clapham Common, this is unbelievably more. It's just as important now. Since the global financial crisis, that you have the Sanders-Clinton rift, you have the Corbyn non-Corbynites rift. You have now, I think, the kind of rifts and disagreements around kind of cultural politics and anti-racism, which we should get into because they're very difficult issues. But I think, in essence, what I would say is they are about people who, for very understandable reasons, have abandoned the liberal democratic project and think liberal democracy cannot be saved. And people like me who say, look, liberal democracy has been hypocritical. It's never lived up to its values. It's born in slavery and oppression, but yet its principles are still the right principles, even if we have been so far from them. And unless we try to revive and renew liberal democracy, well, what's the alternative? What is our alternative if we give up? And so it seems to me that this kind of rift, which is complicated and difficult and hard even to talk about, is even more visceral now than it was in 2003. And in 2003, we felt we needed to do it to keep Labour's energy going. Now I think we need to do it for a very similar reason. I think that we have a Labour Party that's very competent, very solid, good people who I think know what they're doing. They stand in stark contrast to this unspeakable government. But I think there's a lack of flair, there's a lack of excitement. It's not connecting, and it needs to find a way of connecting, because otherwise there's going to be a rift between the activist culture, which is young and demanding and idealistic and angry, and a Labour Party trying to kind of win power without ruffling too many feathers. And I don't think you can sustain that for 3 years, 4 years.
I agree. Let's come back to that, but let's come back to it via an appreciation of Blairism. We've said what we were critical of, but it did have flair. It did have some level of intellectual rigor and some organizational structure. It was professional as well. And just kind of remind people, because I can see, I'm only just glancing at the chat stuff, but people will quite rightly throw Iraq war and, commercialization, privatization, etc. in. But you and I were attracted to it, at least in the early stages, because it did have something about it, didn't it, that we shouldn't throw away. We had a conversation last week, Matthew, with some people about what we should take from Corbynism, because there was excitement and there was, there were things to take from Corbynism. But what should we take from Blairism?
A couple of things. Look, Iraq was a disaster, simple as that. And I wasn't there when the decisions were made, and I worked on the domestic front. But it doesn't matter. Iraq was a disaster. So there we go. Many of the other things that Labour got wrong, it got wrong at a time when a lot of other people were getting that stuff wrong. And there were a few people who said that global financialization was a huge problem and that something needed to be done about it, but not many. There was new public management was in the ascendancy as a way of thinking about public. So yes, it's a fair criticism that Labour didn't step outside the kind of orthodoxy of the time and be more radical. I get all of that, and with the benefit of hindsight, yes. And I've just said, Neil, that you and I felt that, particularly for me around industrial partnership, but also around centralisation, that Labour made big mistakes. But I'm not going to do that thing that Andrew Adonis does so effectively on Twitter and just list the 20 amazing things that Labour did. But there was the minimum wage, and there was, I think it's right. I'm right in saying that no country in history has reduced child poverty in absolute terms as quickly as Labour did. There was the investment in public services. There was the progress on LGBT rights, etc. The devolution to Scotland, Wales, London, etc., etc., etc. There was a lot. So I'm not saying that because I'm going to say that, but it is so facile to identify the things that Labour did not see and should have seen, and disregard all the other stuff. Really.
I agree with that.
So that's that. But look, you asked me to name something about Labour, and I'll tell you the thing that I think that Tony had, and that we have to find a way to have. Is that Tony liked? Tony is a bit of an elitist, as we know. But he actually liked ordinary people in the sense that he kind of shared the instincts of ordinary people. And his view was, what you had to do with progressivism is you had to start from where ordinary people were, and you needed to work with them to try to create a more fair and modern country. And Tony was more a modernizer than a socialist. I freely admit that. But his view of a modern Britain was a fair Britain. It was a fairer Britain, a more inclusive Britain, a more liberal and tolerant Britain. So that's fine, I think that the problem with the left is that, we do tend to find it quite difficult to actually like kind of ordinary people. We care about them, that's one thing, but understanding where they're coming from and appreciating where they're coming from and saying, let's take it seriously, that, people don't want to pay higher taxes, or they care about law and order, or they love their country, and actually don't treat that as something which is awful that you've got to walk your way around or ignore. But no, you go, okay, fine, that's how you feel. So what is the progressive approach to law and order? What's the progressive approach to taxation, which starts with that? And I think that I'm not saying politics is simply about giving people what they want or pandering to what people want, but I'm saying if politics is not about a certain amount of respect for what, ordinary people, what you want to say, is a kind of cross-section of people who aren't particularly political, wouldn't really think themselves as right or left, just getting on with their lives. If politics doesn't really appreciate where those people are coming from and what their concerns are, I think it's not really politics, actually. That's what I'd say. And I think quite often the left is weird. It's very political in one way, but it's not political in the other way, because once you abandon the idea that you have to try to engage people starting from where they are, I think you're not really being political. You're doing something else. You're campaigning, or you're being an activist. You're not really being political, because you're not really getting to the heart of what is necessary to generate change.
And I think in that, one of the most poignant, examples of how we have to do that is that, it's a binary, and obviously the world isn't quite like this. It's much more complicated. But that thing, the gap between the town and the city, the communitarian and the cosmopolitan, people do appreciate that the reality of their life is rooted in different values and different places. And I guess the art of politics is to work out how we bridge what's the duration of a way of overcoming those differences, which are more acute now than they've ever been. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's a whole lot of conversation right now, which is about trying to understand and excavate where people are coming from, particularly in those working class places which have rejected Labour, and to understand what that's all about. And it's right that we're doing it. We have to think deeply about it. And I think that both my wing of the Labour Party and other parts of the party just did not ask themselves that question nearly enough for a very long time. And we're paying the price for that. And our starting point has got to be a deep curiosity about how the people we say we are on the side of feel about the world and see the world, and where they have a sense of agency, and what is a politics that's likely to actually speak to them and their lives. And I think part of the kind of culture, what I crudely call cultural politics, part of that, I think, is an abandonment of that because it's just too difficult, in favor of a kind of purism, which is appealing because it means you don't have to deal with the fact that, ordinary folks don't necessarily see the world the way you want to see them.
Yeah, and the world is played out on Twitter, and it's how many followers you've got, because you can play to those binaries. And I think that's right what you're saying, that it is displacement activity from the real political job. So let's come back to that for a bit before we hand over to Grace and get some other people into the conversation. You said about our job is to save liberal democracy, and I kind of agree with that. But to me, it can't be the old form of liberal democracy, the kind of industrial, clunky, again, top down that we railed against with New Labour. We have to find 21st century versions of liberal democracy, and I think you're trying to do that, the RSA, and Compass are trying to do that, whether that's through policies like UBI or systems like deliberative democracy, etc. Where do you think we're at in that kind of reinvention of systems to give people agency?
Yeah, so I think there's two things, I think. First, I think there's an immense gap between kind of how progressive organizations, charities, progressive corporate organizations, actually, public sector organizations think about change, think about engagement, if they're doing well, and how politics works and how social media works. And so there's this peculiar disconnect. I spend a lot of my time talking to people in all sorts of types of organizations, and they all want to talk about inclusion and engagement and trust and authenticity and purpose. And, it feels like when you're in these rooms, well, we're all kind of progressives now, aren't we? That's good. And then you leave the room and you walk out on the street and you're back in the world of polarization, anger, pessimism. So our political system has become detached in many ways from the day-to-day norms of quite a lot of people. And I think that's something, one of the things that, Neil, that you and I share is that we're interested in constitutional issues. We're interested in localism. And a lot of people on the left find that stuff very tedious. And it's a terrible mistake, because a big part of the reason we are where we are is because of the weakness of our democratic institutions and processes. And if you want one really stark example of that, which isn't from this country, but there are plenty in this country, Joe Biden is going to have to win the American presidential election by 4% to win. He's going to have to win which is a very big margin, because of the Electoral College, right? So if you think that a Trump victory could be almost fatal, because particularly of the fact that it'll mean no more action on climate change, not to mention all the rest. So if you think a Trump victory would be an utter catastrophe for humanity, it could happen not because of politics. It could happen because the Electoral College has remained unreformed, and Trump could lose by several million and still be president. And we would not have Brexit, as I say, as a Brexit opponent, if we had a proportional electoral system in this country. So on the one hand, we've got to take these issues of politics and constitution much more seriously. I'm, as you know, Neil, a complete deliberative democracy kind of bore, and I'm a nerd. So so for me, the first thing is we have to renew democracy. Democracy is like a bicycle. If it's not going forward, it's falling over, and it's not been going forward for a long time, and so it has really badly fallen over. The second thing I want to say, however, is that I also think, and this is our annual lecture, which people can find online. It's also one of my podcasts. I think another starting point is us, is human beings. And I haven't got time to make this argument now, but I think the genius of liberal democracy, or the genius of the Enlightenment, and I want to say in brackets that the Enlightenment was a project which is dripping with blood and oppression and slavery and hypocrisy and all of that, and I completely get that. But still, nevertheless, the principles of the Enlightenment, which I would say are three: autonomy, universalism, and humanism, or to put them more demotically, freedom, universalism, and progress. Those are brilliant principles. And what liberal democracy does is it finds a way of trying to manage the different imperatives that those three ideas bring. Try to balance freedom with universalism in order to generate progress. And that, for me, is the only way you can really think about society working. But to make it work, we need a different kind of subject. Human beings have to be different. And the one thing I said in my annual lecture, and I'll finish with this, is I've tried in my lecture to bring together two debates that don't ever come together. One was this debate about liberal democracy and refurnishing it and renewing it, and is it possible? And my fear is that however tainted and problematic it is, there is no better alternative. And secondly, all the revolution in the last 30 years that's come about through cognitive science, through behavioral economics, social psychology, anthropology, understanding ourselves better. And what I argued in the age of reflexivity is that for liberal democracy to work, we need to understand ourselves better somehow, because part of what's going on at the moment is that we as individual political subjects, social subjects, have uncontainable needs and desires, and the uncontainability of this is then articulated at a political and social level. So I know it sounds like a terribly abstract idea, but all that stuff, that cognitive science stuff, is real. It really has changed the way we think about ourselves. And if only we could take those insights into our existence as political subjects, we might then create a democracy that is based around who we really are as human beings. Anyway.
Well, I take that, and I think if you add that cognitive realization along with social media and a network society, you've got the recipe for something really interesting. And my last question before we do go to others is, the problem is that all of that, whether it's our understanding of ourselves and our connections and our ability to mobilize ourselves and others in the world and know, learn and think and act, hits up against this old political system. So we talk about 45-degree change, this emerging, bubbling up, whatever, and it needs the state and the vertical to support it. Well, there's so little to hang your hat on the vertical. There's no holes, there's no cracks, or too few in order to kind of accelerate and amplify and aggregate that stuff that you've just been talking about. How do we see our way through that catch-22 of the old system refusing to change and modernise, and us just get down the kind of glass walls of the state because there's nowhere to grip onto?
So I'm getting distracted now by the Zoom chat.
Answer my question.
I will answer your question.
The constitutional stuff and the party stuff. It's so out of date, isn't it?
Yeah. So my answer to that is the thing that one of the other intellectual journeys I've been on, he said very pompously, is just to recognise the contingent nature of stuff. And that, at the RSA, we use a phrase to describe our approach to change. We talk about thinking like a system and acting like an entrepreneur. And I think that's the mindset we have to have, which is we have to understand and think and reflect on the systemic nature of, the way things are. And, there are brilliant thinkers like Indy Johar, I think, who are doing great work, understanding the deep structure of society. I think we have to do that intellectual work. It's really important. But I think on the other hand, we have to have a highly kind of entrepreneurial, agile, adaptive, opportunistic approach to change, which is that you don't know where it's going to come from. We don't know in the end what COVID is going to lead to, for example. And I think we have to kind of just stay alert, and we have to have the organization, which means that when opportunities for change emerge, as they do, because we're in a volatile world, you have the capacity to grab the opportunity and then to grab the one after it, and then to grab the one after it, and then to grab the one after it. That's all you can do. It's no good banging your head against a brick wall. You've just got to kind of hold it together. And when those opportunities arise, you've got to go through them, as the populists have done over the last few years. They have an incredibly, Putin's playbook, which is never be predictable and never be boring, and that what the populists do is they're constantly watching for opportunities to take forward their kind of project. And we've got to, I don't want to borrow anything else in the populist playbook, but we've got to be much more agile when opportunities arise to take a step forward and then know what the next step is, and know what the next step is, and know what the next step is.
Hello, this is Grace from the Compass office, interrupting you for a moment. I'm lucky enough to come from a large and politically diverse family. We really did have the full political spectrum represented over Christmas dinner, but in spite of our differences, we still actually like each other. I've always known, because of this, that politics should be more about listening and learning from the people we disagree with than shouting at them and fighting with them. And of course, I've definitely known for a long time that it really is bloody complicated. So I was so happy that when one day I discovered Compass, quite by accident, through their brilliant work on the Progressive Alliance in the 2017 general election. Since then, it's been an absolute pleasure to once again be part of a political family where talking to people in different political parties, admitting that you alone don't have all the answers, is not just okay, but actively encouraged. So if you'd like to find out more about Compass, you can visit compassonline.org.uk. And now, back to the conversation.
Grace, over to you. Bring some more people into this conversation.
Sure, okay. I've got a question from Caridwen.
Yeah, really interested in it's kind of what you've just been speaking to, but you spoke to this earlier on. What really excites you as ways of building bridges across differences, whatever the differences are? What do you see as exciting ways that we can connect across differences?
Yeah, thank you. And that is, it is a kind of obsession of mine. In fact, I tried to do a Radio 4 program about it. We did some programs called Agree to Differ, and what it was based on was getting people to agree what they disagreed about. And it didn't really work because I wasn't good enough, and also the guests ended up agreeing with each other too quickly for the 40-minute program, so they dumped it. And then much to my kind of misery, they took the basic idea and they've given it to Anne McElvoy, who's making it work quite well, actually. So anyway, that's humiliating. One a long line of personal humiliations. But anyway, the point I'm making is that you've got to, one of the ways to do it is to try to have a honest conversation about what you disagree about. And that's how mediation works. So in my view, listening is very important. And one of the ways to structure listening is to say, look, we disagree about this. We disagree about your definition of white. I mean, I take an issue now. We disagree about the way you're defining white supremacy, for example. Okay, well, we don't have a big row about that. We can call each other names, or let's respectfully try to work out what it is we disagree about here. And in my experience, if you do work out what it is you disagree about, you can normally make progress. And normally you find out you don't disagree about quite as much as you thought you did, which some people find threatening because they quite like disagreement. But so I think that there's a kind of process element to building bridges. But the second thing is you have to really believe in it. And I believe that politics, I said this earlier, politics is about building coalitions. And that's the politics I'm interested in. So I'm building bridges all the time because I'm always trying to create new coalitions. I've spent my whole life trying to build new coalitions and generally failing, but I'm always open to it.
Thanks, brilliant. Next question is coming from Kieran.
Okay, yeah. So my question was that political parties are relatively small beasts, even allowing for the kind of Corbyn surge. And we know there are loads of skills and creativity across our society. Look at the response to COVID-19. How do we get those people involved? People who don't want to join political parties, but have skills, creativity, and want to make the world a better place. And are political parties increasingly an archaic structure?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kieran, and you're speaking to something which kind of there's a certain amount of personal pain attached to, because I've always believed that political parties need to be agents for change in the communities that they operate in, and that should be the starting point, and that the most successful political movements very often are those ones, progressive ones, are those ones which have very deep roots in the community and which are there first and foremost. This is the origins of the Labour Party. Well, Labour movement are actually there to help people change their own lives. They're not just about knocking on doors and getting members and raising money and getting a group of people into power. They're actually about working to make change happen, here and now. And I think that's the model that the party should have. And when I used to work for the Labour Party, I tried to push that idea forward. And in the end, I didn't make that much progress with it, because in the end, the imperatives of organisation, the imperatives of door knocking and fundraising and membership seemed to push out the idea. And I remember in 1997, you remember this, Neil, one of the things that Labour did that was really great, and then it just completely fizzled out, and I never understood why, was when the New Deal, 1997, we had this policy, the New Deal, which was to fund welfare to work for using the monopoly profits of the nationalised industries. And when we first did that, what Gordon Brown's team did was they sent to every MP a set of things that they could do locally to be part of making this happen, how they could talk to young people and visit jobs. I don't know what it is, but it was, the idea was, this is not a policy that's just going to be come down from the top. This is the thing that you as a local MP can really help this happen. You can make it happen. You can be a social entrepreneur. And it was great. And it happened for a few months, and I don't know whether it was civil servants or I don't know, but anyway, it was killed off. It never happened again. I thought when Labour was in power, what we would do is continuously give MPs, councillors tools to enable them to be change makers in their community, and we never did. And I think that's what parties need to do. So I don't think the party has to have hundreds of thousands of members. What I think it does have to have is members who are change makers in their community. And I think if you are a change maker in your community, you'll build people's trust, and then you can take them on one side and you can say, how about joining the Labour Party? And they're quite likely to say yes, which is probably better than just knocking on the door as a stranger and say, will you put a poster up in your window? I mean, that is important, don't get me wrong. But so that's my view, is political parties have to be catalysts for change, not simply machines for getting people into power.
Thanks, Matthew. Next, I'm going to bring in Anthony Barnett.
Hi there, Matthew. And very interesting. I'm just puzzling about what you were saying about the Labour Party, because I completely agree with you about John Monk's marvellous guy, head of running the TUC, obviously an ally, just left to, just the spin, hang there in the, and everything you say about, the capacity of Blair in particular, who liked people, all the positive things that the new Labour government did, and yet clearly it ended in failure. And it seems to me that there must be, that something was going wrong, which wasn't about, which you can't then say, oh, well, we just got to be practical and the leftists are all sort of headbangers, so let's be a reformist. Something went wrong. They had a project, which, I feel Starmer doesn't have. They did have flair around this project. And that story of what that's about is absolutely central to the history of New Labour and what went wrong. And it seemed to me that a whole lot of that project, especially with Blair, but in a different way with Gordon Brown, was about power. And, writing his messages to Bush saying we must run the world together when they invaded Iraq, and refusing, therefore, to precipitate the deep reform of the British state, which was needed to unleash all that energy from below, which then got wasted.
Yeah. So, Anthony, I totally agree. And by the way, a few weeks ago, you wrote a piece, probably for Open Democracy. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and you should put it in the Zoom chat. I thought it was a brilliant piece. So I can't remember anything about it. I just remember when I read it, I thought this is a fantastic piece. So I think it was about the world now. Anyway, so thank you for writing that. And I'm embarrassed that I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember it made an enormous impression on me. So I think you're right, entirely right. And I think that this was what Labour failed at. And this is what we have to remember, is that I remember, look, a few years ago when Ed Miliband was leader, someone in Ed's office contacted me and said, have you got any ideas for the conference speech? I'm sure they contacted Neil as well. It was kind of diplomacy, really. There's your piece. It's an amazing piece. I said, look, here's a line I think Ed should put in his speech, because I think one of the things that people worry about with Ed is they think he's a bit statist. And the line I said that Ed should put in the speech was, look, to the Labour Party conference, was, look, there's an election coming. And you think that, if we win the election, we'll take power. And I want to say to you, that's not how it works. The way it works is, if we win the election, we win the opportunity to create power. We don't take power, we win the opportunity to create it. And I think that you're absolutely right, Anthony, that there were lots of things that Labour got wrong, specifically Iraq, obviously, and policy ideas, and of course the awful melodrama of the Blair Brown stuff. But the political thing I think it got wrong domestically was not recognizing the need to have a project that was about structural change in order to empower people. And we've talked about the elements of that. One element would have been, because if you remember the history, Anthony, what happened was that Will Hutton wrote his book about stakeholder capitalism, and Tony made a speech about that, which was a good speech. And then I think Murdoch in particular went bonkers about it, and Labour freaked out, and the whole stakeholder capitalism thing was thrown by the wayside. And so that really big project, which should have been about, taking best elements of the continental model and bringing, industrial democracy, industrial partnership, that fell. And then secondly, in the end, there wasn't really serious devolution within England. It wasn't as bad as the kind of level of centralization we're seeing again right now, actually. But there wasn't a genuine and really powerful attempt to empower. Of course, there was the failure of the regional government initiative as well. So there are excuses that can be made. But nevertheless, I think you're right. And I think that what the lesson, therefore, for the party is that, our project has got to be ultimately one of structural reform in order to empower people, at work, in their community. And we lost sight of that. I think in the end, New Labour felt the way to make change happen was to pull levers, and pull good levers. There were good levers that it pulled, and sometimes you do have to pull levers. But that part of the progressive project, and look, it's not a new argument. I mentioned earlier to Neil the David Marquand's book, The Progressive Dilemma, which is one of the most influential books in my political development. It was just all about this. It was all about how Labour constantly moves toward between this kind of notion of empowering and devolving and a kind of heart's view of the world and a kind of technocratic, centralising, lever-pulling view of the world. And so that's if I was going to take a political lesson from New Labour as well as all the specific lessons you could take, it would be that.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Probably the last question we'll have time for is coming from Bryony.
Climate scientists say that we have 10 years at most to avoid a catastrophe. So I'm wondering where you rank the climate emergency in your thinking. And I'm always struck in these webinars by the absence of any reference, thinking about making alliances, any reference to XR, which seems to be full of courageous, lively, imaginative, creative young people. And I'm wondering why that is.
Yeah, so, wow, Brian, it's such an interesting question. It's actually something I think about a lot. So on the climate emergency, you're absolutely right. And, this is why, this American election is so unbelievably important, because we just don't have 4 years of doing nothing. And that's what will happen. Well, no, people will do things, but it will be so difficult, so much more difficult. So, yeah, the climate emergency is absolutely central, and I think it's an opportunity to talk about how we have to change in order to be able to live sustainably, and the opportunities that provides. And none of that's a new debate. And what I've learned in politics is that sometimes debates go on for years and years and years and years, and then suddenly they break through. And we just have to continue to say that the climate emergency is absolutely the top priority, and that the best way to respond to the climate emergency is through a progressive approach, because you can't solve the climate emergency unless you're doing that through a commitment to equality and participation. You can't, you won't, there's no way of responding, I think, without a progressive frame, which is why I think it's going to be really hard for this government, despite the fact that it's got a commendable policy in terms of its net zero target. I think it's going to be hard for it to take it forward, because it's going to involve shifts which will be very difficult to sell to the base of the Conservative Party and to their friends in the kind of in the media. In terms of Extinction Rebellion, I thought XR's first stuff last autumn was absolutely brilliant. I think it was last autumn. I took my hat off. It was clever. It was funny. It was, it was unbelievably fresh, and it had a huge impact. I worry now that XR, for whom I have enormous sympathy, I worry that they are playing the same tune each time, and that it's allowing people to caricature them. And I think that, talking of building bridges, what we've got to do is to think about how does that energy flow in to the system. There's got to be some thought about that. And that's hard, because XR is a particular organizational form, and the kinds of hard choices that have to be made when you say, look, it's fine protesting and doing amazing things which are funny and clever and brilliant, but yet in the end we've got to be winning people over, and we've got to be influencing policymakers. That's always a very difficult moment for any campaign. And so I think XR is fantastic, but I can see the organizational dilemma it has now, which is that each time it does what it does, there's more of a backlash. I'm not agreeing with that backlash, a bit of inconvenience, newspapers not being printed for a day. I'm not kind of saying, oh, that's the end of civilization, how dare they? But I'm saying that each time it becomes easier to caricature it as being a bunch of middle-class young people just buggering things up, however strong their views are for everybody else. And I'm not saying that's what it is, but that's how it is being increasingly caricatured. So it has to get to another stage, XR, and that's really hard, particularly, as I say, because of its organizational form. So that's a bridge I'd like to build. I'd like to talk more to XR people and say, where does it go next? Because I'm just not sure that whatever the next thing you want to shut down is, or the next disco outside Parliament, or wherever it happens, it's all great. But I worry that what it's ending up doing, what it will end up doing if we're not careful, is just build a bigger bridge and kind of say, if you don't think this stuff is great, you're not really green. And I think that there's a lot of people who have more conventional ways of thinking about change, who would be part allies in climate action, and we mustn't completely disillusion them.
So I think one of the big bridges that's been built, and Compass has done it a bit with its championing of citizens' assemblies over Brexit, and you've done it, Matthew, at the RSA. It's not an accident that the biggest demand of XR is a citizens' assembly on climate change.
And I totally support that.
So I think there is a coming together of different people, arriving at solutions, and that gives me hope. I get hope from lots of places. That's kept me doing Compass longer than you've been doing the RSA, Matthew. What gives you hope? What gets you out of bed? What gets you motivated? What gives you, the thought that things can get better? There was a song, wasn't there, called "Things Can Only Get Better"? I seem to recall. Go on, tell us where you get hope from, Matthew.
This is a trite answer, Neil, but I don't really have hope in the sense that what I mean by that is I'm really, and this is something I talk about a lot when I talk about the future of work. I think prediction is a problematic activity, because I think the very act of predicting the future disempowers us, because it suggests that the thing about the future is to find out what it is rather than to create what it is. And so I've always subscribed to a line I think I first read in a book written by Cornel West and Roberto Unger, which is, it's not hope that leads to action as much as action that leads to hope. And so in the end, I don't really hope because, as I said to you earlier, the world is so indeterminate, the contingency is so great. All I can do is get stuck in, really. And it's being stuck in that gives me hope. A great day at work, talking to people who are trying to make change happen. A great event where it feels to me that people have moved from an entrenched position and created an interesting new space. It's stuff that happens. Reading a fantastic article, which, like Anthony's, that gives a different light on things. So, yeah, I'm not a hoper. I'm an actor. If that doesn't sound too something pious, pompous, silly, trite.
No, it doesn't sound any of those things. And it's been really great getting stuck into this conversation with you, Matthew. Thanks so much for your time and your wisdom and your experience. Thanks to all of our members for being on the call and asking some good questions. Next week, we're going to be discussing how we get electoral reform. It's an issue that's central to our political project and has come up today with Matthew. We need to know how we're going to get there, not just how we're going to demand it, but how we're going to actually make it happen. Joining Francis next week will be Kleiner Jordan from Make Votes Matter, Darren Hughes, the CEO of the Electoral Reform Society, and Nicola Haylock from a new organisation called Get PR Done. So I look forward to that. In the meantime, before that, thank you again, especially Matthew. Thank you, everyone. Keep safe, keep well. And you can either keep hopeful or you can keep getting stuck in, as Matthew suggests. Take care. Good night.
Bye, everybody.
So, if you like what you've heard today and want to be part of a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, a good society, then visit us at compassonline.org.uk/podcast, and you'll be able to join us live on future calls just like this one. You can tweet me at Neil, NEAL_Compass, or Compass at Compass Office. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a rating. It will help us reach more listeners in the future. And it's only fair that they know it's bloody complicated too.